The reality is that in order to overcome the climate crisis, forest protection can be up to half of the climate change mitigation equation. And we can't get there without protecting forests. We simply can't do it.
Welcome to Facing Future. Today's guests are Chad Hansen, a forest and fire ecologist at the John Muir Project and author of the book Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths. We also have Nick Phillips, who is the head of forest policy at the Woodland Trust in the UK. And today we're going to talk about what's happening between the two countries in terms of forests, old growth forests, and the conversion of forests into supposedly renewable wood pellets. So, Chad, would you like to begin?
Sure. In a nutshell, from a climate change standpoint, and I talk about this a lot in my book, Smokescreen, the key thing that I think we need to understand, nations around the world who are concerned about climate change and overcoming the climate crisis, is that at this point, we need to do not one, but two things to overcome the climate crisis. We need to rapidly shift away from fossil fuels, of course, and I think there's broad recognition of that, obviously, at this point. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that's not nearly enough at this point. There would be a large gap. The problem is that once we put all that excess CO2 into the atmosphere through fossil fuel burning and consumption and also logging activities, it stays up there for a very, very long time. The residence time, as we call it, of CO2 in the atmosphere is extremely long, many, many decades, even centuries. And so in order to reduce the dangerous excess CO2 levels, we have to draw it down and not just stop putting so much up there. And in order to draw it down, that means we're going to have to protect a lot more of natural ecosystems around the world, especially forests, because they draw down atmospheric carbon better and faster than any other ecosystem. We're going to have to protect a lot more from logging in order to accomplish that. Logging activities in general are a major threat to climate solutions, but even more so when logging is done for wood pellets or forest biomass. In other words, when trees are cut down like giant sticks of coal to be incinerated for energy production. And there's a lot of misleading information about that out there from the industry trying to claim that trees are a renewable or a clean energy resource. Nothing could be further from the truth. When you incinerate wood, trees, or portions of trees for energy, it emits even more CO2 into the atmosphere than burning coal.
That's really incredible.
Yeah, it
of
is.
all the myths.
Yeah. And that's the key thing for equal, and there's a lot of other aspects to this that make it even worse than that. But for equal energy produced, burning trees or portions of trees for energy is even worse than coal, significantly so. Conservatively, 30 or 40% more CO2 produced for equal energy generated. And so, it's a climate change nightmare. It's the last thing we should be doing is cutting down our forests and putting that carbon into the atmosphere.
So, Chad, in the UK, there's a huge biomass factory, or many of them, and wood pellets are being billed as the new renewable and garnering renewable energy funds. What's happening there?
Yeah, it's a really important question at the moment. So there's a lot of political focus in the UK on woodland expansion, which is around the climate crisis, and we would argue is the biodiversity crisis. We've got twin crises. We need to tackle them both, and it's really important at the moment. But as Chad was saying, totally agree. Really, it's as important, if not more important, to look after what you've already got. And I think there's often too much focus on just getting trees in the ground, and particularly in the UK, and actually looking after those trees, but also looking after the woodland we've already got. So in the UK, sadly, we've largely removed most of our woodland cover. We've got about 13% woodland cover in the UK, of which about half of that is native woodland, but a very small fraction of that is ancient woodland. So it's a real challenge. And one of the things with the UK as well, it's about our overseas footprint. So we import a huge amount of wood into the UK. About 80% of the wood that the UK uses is imported. And between 2011 and 2015, wood imports have increased quite significantly. And the main reason for that is a lot of it is actually imported from the US. It's wood pellets that have been burnt. There's a really strong case in the UK for expanding our tree cover, and that's both from native woodland, but also for productive forests in the right place. If they're done sensitively, that doesn't mean we should be burning that wood, because you're releasing that carbon straight up into the atmosphere again. And it's really important to think about, we all use wood in our lives, and it's really important to think about how to lock up that carbon for as long as possible, both in existing forests, but also in wood products that are used. Burning is one of the most inefficient ways to store that carbon because it's being released immediately. Whereas there are other uses for it, such as locking up in buildings, for example, or construction materials, where you're then not using high emitting materials like concrete, and where it can have a value. But it's really important where that wood comes from, and it clearly shouldn't be coming from primary forests.
We're also replanting, we call it reforestation, but not always the right species. The classic example, of course, is the palm oil disaster in Indonesia, where we hardly replaced the forest and destroyed the habitat for millions of animals, which we're doing all over the world. A tree is not a tree is not a tree. They're all different species of trees. And so putting the wrong species in the wrong place is causing a great deal of harm around the world.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, one of the key things that's happening, and I think it's something we all need to be very cognizant of and careful of, is the conversion of native forests into tree plantations, whether it's palm oil, whether it's some kind of a timber species. And a tree plantation is not the same as a native forest. And so it's one of the things people get confused by. They hear the term deforestation. They think, well, the deforestation, that's just happening in Brazil. And it's really because of the way people define deforestation around the world, or the historical definition, which is basically permanent conversion of forest into some non-tree cover. But the reality is that when you cut down a native forest and you plant a tree plantation, especially a monoculture crop, it's really not a forest anymore. It's really a form of deforestation. And I think one of the things we need to do is start shifting away from wood consumption in general. Just like we're shifting away from fossil fuels, so that we can store a lot more carbon in our forests, and we can allow a lot more of those kind of ecologically sterile tree plantations around the world to become native forests again, because nature will do that over time.
We don't understand wildness. We think it's irrelevant. We want things to be neat and organized, and nature does not. Nature is not neat. One of the things that's also happening is the live trees being imported are creating, just like the virus spreads among humanity, diseases spread among trees. And when you bring imports, you're disrupting the system.
Yeah, this is kind of an issue that I think isn't as widely talked about as it should be. And, the movement of wood and live trees, we've got this global trade that is moving plants and animals around and spreading pests and diseases in areas and ecosystems that aren't used to them and can't deal with them. So just as an example, in the UK, ash dieback is a disease. Ash trees are one of our most common, one of our most common native trees, and supporting a huge proportion of the UK's wildlife. And unfortunately, this disease was imported, and we're now set to lose up to about 80% of them. And a huge amount of mature trees. The carbon that's stored in this is huge, and it's predicted to cost the UK, which we're a pretty small island nation, about 15 billion, which was way more than the value in terms of the import value of actually importing the trees. So it's a climate catastrophe, it's a wildlife catastrophe. And this is where, when you have targets for expanding tree cover, it's so important where those trees come from. It's not just about meeting the target of numbers of trees in the ground. If you get that wrong, you can cause way more devastation. And unfortunately, it keeps happening. It's an increasing problem across the globe.
I was astonished to see in the Drax website the statement that young trees, which are still growing, sequester far more carbon than old growth trees, which is, if I'm not mistaken, a blatant lie.
It's highly misleading to the point of outright falsehood. So here's what logging interests do when they say things like that. If you take a tiny little seedling, a tree seedling that's 1 or 2 years old, that they plant in the ground, and if you look at the amount of carbon that's in that, and then the proportional amount of carbon it has, a year or 2 years later, well, you could say, well, gosh, it's adding 30% or 40% of its carbon per year, and when it's that size, of course, that's a percentage, but the absolute amount is tiny. And you only get into significant amounts of annual carbon added, and therefore annual CO2 pulled out of the atmosphere once a tree reaches a certain level of maturity. And the big myth that the logging industry engages in with the public and with policymakers and with the press is this idea that once trees get mature, they basically stop growing. That's just false. That's flatly false. And what they use to promote that myth is the idea of the growth rings. If you look at a tiny little tree, of course, and you look at the growth rings, they're wider when they're younger. And then you could think, oh, well, gosh, they're growing faster, and therefore the carbon sequestration is higher when they're younger, those growth rings. And when they get bigger, those growth rings are very, very narrow, annual rings. The problem is that's 2 dimensions, and trees are not in 2 dimensions, they're in 3 dimensions. And this is just geometry. And those tiny, tiny little growth rings, when a tree is mature, add far more carbon and pull far more carbon out of the atmosphere than a large growth ring in a very, very small tree. And just let me give you one example, just to put this in perspective. The largest tree on the planet, in terms of just overall biomass and carbon, is the General Sherman tree. It's a giant sequoia tree in the southern Sierra Nevada. And I know it well. I've seen it many times. This tree is over 2,000 years old. It's over 200 feet tall. It's something like 38 feet in diameter at breast height, and not quite 40, I think. It's huge, and it's ancient. And the growth rings, the annual growth rings, are tiny. They're so small. I don't know if you could see it with the naked eye. They're tiny, tiny, tiny. Yet, because it's so big and because it exists in 3 dimensions, that tree every single year is adding an amount of wood that's equivalent to a tree 50 feet tall and 1 foot in diameter every single year.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah. So they're looking at the growth ring and saying, oh, well, it's much bigger. But they're not recognizing the diameter or the size of the tree. Wow. Okay. Let's look for a minute again at the importing and exporting of wood. Obviously, the transport itself is not very ecological. What can be done, and what could we have instead of this wood import? Is it sawdust that's just being used, or is it really trees that are going into that?
In the UK context, we've largely removed, sadly, most of our native forest. There's definitely a case for, in the right areas. Half of our native ancient woodland is still under plantation forestry, which needs to be restored. But there is a case in the UK. We've got, we put a lot of our impact is overseas, both the food and our timber. And there is a case for sustainable plantations in the right places to provide timber. And I think when that timber is used, we should be using that in the most efficient way possible, recycling where possible, and looking for the longest lived products. And it's important that we're really clear on definitions. I think sometimes the word forest, I think Chad mentioned this is a really important point. It can be a bit misleading and applied to anything. So I think having, particularly in policy, different types of forests do need different mechanisms and different types of protection. But yeah, certainly the UK, we would see scope for expansion of native woodlands, agroforestry potentially as well, where we've got most of our country's farmland. And there's definitely a case for farmers to integrate trees into their farming practices. They can have lots of benefits for soil. Ammonia pollution is a really big problem with high intensive agriculture. Trees can have a really important there. They can help reduce flood risk in the right places and capture carbon and benefit wildlife. So there's lots of benefits in the right places, but it's not a blanket fix-all. It really, really does depend on such an overused phrase, but the right tree going into the right place. And that really requires the right politics. And it means that targets on the quality of new tree cover is as important as the quantity.
I think the UK was originally mostly forests. Now it's mostly sheep. When I was in Scotland for the climate conference, we were kind of astonished that it was all fields full of sheep and very little forest. Is that being dealt with? Is there a move to re-wild Scotland?
Yeah, it's a really interesting. I mean, there's large parts of our landscape that are treeless. Really, there's a growing call for allowing trees to self-seed, woodlands to self-seed and spread themselves, because the evidence is building in the UK context for that woodland cover that's effectively naturally succeeded to be the best form of adaptation to climate change, because our trees are incredibly genetically diverse, and allowing them to breed and spread effectively that way really helps them adapt to climate change. But progress is very slow. So we've got about 13% tree cover in the UK, and we're only just marginally above moving beyond that at the moment. And most of the UK is privately owned. So it's really about how you can persuade and incentivize those private farmers and managers to, who need an income, a living, to move away from potential quite traditional farming practices. So we see kind of integration of trees into farming as kind of the initial way, and then perhaps that larger scale native woodland creation could be kind of the next stage. But it's very variable across the UK, and Scotland is probably where we're seeing most, whereas the rest of the UK is seeing a lot less new tree cover.
Well, in the United States, we have a lot of national forests, which is not helping us because the Forest Service, as Chad and I talked about previously, has a kind of a logging quota every year and is, quote, thinning the forest. What's the problem with this idea that you can go in and thin a forest and make it more fire resistant, or, better for floods, or what is thinning the forest actually mean? Restoring the forest by thinning it.
This is a key conversation about different euphemisms that are used to justify logging, and the kind of the term byproducts. Because this is something we hear a lot. This is not logging. This is restoration. This is fuel reduction. This is forest health. This is resilience work. This is reforestation. There's a whole series of these euphemisms, and what we're actually seeing is mature trees being removed, old growth trees being removed, a really ecologically important post-fire habitat. Because fires are natural in the forest, and a lot of species depend on post-fire habitat. Those areas are being clear-cut. Entire landscapes on private lands are being clear-cut in the southeastern United States, and native forests including, and those are being turned into wood pellets and then exported to the UK to be incinerated, and all that carbon turned to the atmosphere at the Drax plants. So, this is not just, when people hear the term byproduct, or they hear some of these euphemisms like thinning or fuel reduction or forest health, be very, very skeptical. Here's what thinning means on national forests in the United States. People hear the term thinning, they think of pruning shears, and really they don't realize that we're talking about chainsaws and bulldozers. The typical thinning project, so-called, kills and removes between 70 and 80% of the trees in a given stand, including many mature and old growth trees. And the thing is about this is that, even when sometimes that's mostly for biomass, but even when, ostensibly the primary purpose is lumber production, the key thing to understand is that when a tree is removed from the forest, most of its carbon goes into the atmosphere almost immediately, even if ostensibly it's being removed for lumber, because a large portion of the carbon is in the branches and the treetops, which is not usable in lumber. Those get incinerated at biomass plants, and that carbon goes into the atmosphere. Then the log goes to the timber mill, and then of course the bark and the round parts and all the parts between where the saw blades go, is not usable for lumber, and only about 20 or 25%, maybe 30% of a tree ends up in a wood product somewhere, usually not for very long. And the rest is incinerated at the lumber mill as what they call hog fuel. Again, biomass energy, which is, as I said before, worse than coal. So, from a larger standpoint, we all use wood products, and we will, we're not going to stop using them, tomorrow. What I think a growing chorus of scientists around the world are saying is that we need to start a shift away from wood products and to more native forest cover, restoring more native forest cover, protecting more native forests, and storing a lot more carbon in our forests, and starting to shift away to non-wood alternatives, because there are many really good ones now, including structural hempcrete that's load-bearing for housing and commercial structures, which is really coming on strong now.
Hemp is a really interesting product. You can use it, you mix it with lime and make concrete out of it. which is a huge source of carbon. Our carbon footprint is concrete. One of the other things, I think there's a laminated wood product that's being billed as a green CLT.
Well, that's a real concern. So I was one of more than 200 climate scientists and forest scientists that sent a letter to Congress on this issue in 2020. And what we said, we just pointed out to members of Congress, because a lot of them had this idea in their minds, if you cut down a tree, that there's kind of this one-to-one relationship in carbon storage, that all the carbon in that tree ends up in a wood product. And they didn't realize that most of the carbon in those trees is ending up in the atmosphere. And then, of course, when you remove trees from forests, you're removing key nutrients that those forests need to maintain their productivity, to continue to effectively pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. You're also compacting and damaging soils with the logging equipment. So every time you go in and log, whether it's clear cutting or what they call euphemistically thinning, you're actually reducing the carbon sequestration capacity of the forest. And it takes the forest a very, very long time, decades, to recover that carbon and recover their carbon sequestration capacity. And of course, we don't have decades with the climate crisis. We can't afford to be putting a lot more carbon into the atmosphere now, based upon the theory that somehow it'll all be made up for many decades from now. And so we just pointed some of these things out. Some members of Congress are listening, some members are not. But it's something we really need to be talking about, is that this is not a solution. We really need to be shifting to less consumption, smaller structures, less consumption, more recycled, more non-wood materials, and really just reduce our footprint.
Well, the wood skyscraper is a new invention that we've seen around. I suppose this is not a really good idea.
It's a terrible idea. If we turn to our forests increasingly for skyscrapers, we are going to further deplete our native forests around the world. More native forests will be converted to tree plantations. And again, as Nick pointed out, this is a climate crisis issue. It's also a biodiversity crisis issue. Our forests have been seriously fragmented. Our native forests have been lost and converted to agriculture and tree plantations all around the world. And they can't take any more of these impacts. So we cannot turn to our forests even more and turn our forests into giant skyscrapers. We just can't afford to do that. We need to be shifting to non-wood alternatives and recycled alternatives. And we need to be reducing our overall footprint and our consumption. So
we talked about hemp. Are there any other products that could be used instead of wood?
Well, sure. I mean, there are a number of them out there. Hemp and hempcrete. Some companies are producing load-bearing structural hempcrete now, including for foundations. So it's actually replacing concrete. And so it's an interesting alternative, and it actually is slightly carbon negative, which is kind of cool. And that can take a lot of impact away from forests. But it's not the only one. I mean, some people are using recycled light gauge steel for both residential and commercial construction. The carbon footprint is higher there than hempcrete, but it's significantly lower than it is for forests. Once you consider all of the full carbon accounting for forests, including the transportation, including the carbon sequestration loss when you remove trees from forests and damage the soil, including the fact that most of the carbon in the trees is incinerated and ends up in the atmosphere before it becomes a lumber, and only a portion becomes a lumber product. When you account for all of that, it actually ends up being the worst of all the alternatives, trees. It's a really bad way to go. We need the trees in our forests. So, I mean, in my view, we need to keep the carbon in the ground, and we need to start keeping more of the carbon in the forests.
I think in the UK, it's a similar but slightly different picture. I mean, I think certainly from a native forest perspective, they should not be where we should be seeking large proportions of our wood use. But given that the UK isn't going to stop using timber anytime soon, and it can, it's thinking about trade-offs as well. So if they use an alternative material, it needs to be thinking about, well, what's the carbon, water consequences of that? And if we are growing a different material using agriculture land, you might be then displacing that agriculture, which then, I think as Chad says, you need to think of the whole life cycle analysis really, and ensure that there aren't missing bits. So totally, branches, all the soil impacts. So 75% of the carbon in the UK forest is in the soil. So you need to really think about your harvesting and low impact. But there's in the UK context, which is different, wood products, I think, do have a role, and that particularly reducing our overseas footprint. But we should certainly be seeking better use of the materials as well that we already have, and particularly things like recycling. But I mean, concrete in the UK is often the go-to for building materials, which is pretty horrific from a carbon perspective. We certainly should be seeking greener materials.
Yeah, I completely agree on concrete. I mean, concrete's a disaster from a climate change standpoint. So we don't want to be turning to concrete, and we certainly don't want to be turning to raw steel. I think recycled steel brings the carbon footprint way down, and I think that's part of the conversation. But there's still a significant carbon footprint. Just looking at residential construction in the United States, it was normal for homes to be 1,000 square feet, 1,200 square feet. Sometimes smaller, just not that many decades ago. And then it became 1,800 square feet, and then it became 2,400 square feet. And then everyone wanted a 4,000 square foot home, for a family of 3 or 4. And the thing is, we don't need that. I mean, my wife grew up in a home that was 1,000 square feet. She had a family of 4, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. It was laid out so intelligently. It doesn't feel small at all. And nowadays, for a family of 4, it's 4,000 square feet for a lot of people. So, we don't need to do that. We really, these are choices that we're making, and we can make different choices, and we kind of need to at this point.
Yeah, our lifestyle needs to change, because renewables we're not going to have solar farms replacing every bit of agricultural land that we now have. The solution, really, everybody says, is reduction of what we consider our lifestyle. One of my favorite projects, of course, is the elimination of the industrial animal agriculture with its monocultures of corn and soy and its use of land that is so devastating to our soils and to land use. If we converted those lands to rewilding, returned them to nature, we could create, we'd have habitat for the animals, and we would have much more land to grow actual food for people rather than growing them for cows and pigs and so forth. Anything else you'd like to say?
Only that I just think, I think for policymakers, I think this is probably a case around the globe, really. I think is that, that there is a really important, and from our perspective, welcome focus on expanding forests. But I think we mustn't forget what we already have. And I think there's a really key policy job for probably the public to make sure that when we're spending resources, we are also looking at, particularly existing natural forests, old growth trees that we know have an extremely high value, that we must make sure we don't forget those.
I strongly agree. This is the number one priority, is protecting existing forests from logging, protecting them entirely from logging where possible. In my view, that's the top priority. Dramatically reducing logging where logging still continues. We need to start doing that in a very, very purposeful and bold way in nations, forested nations all around the world. Because you asked earlier about planting trees. And the problem is, again, planting trees, it's often associated with clear cutting. And of course, that's what the logging industry doesn't mention, is all the trees that were removed before you planted the trees and all the carbon that goes into the atmosphere as a result of that. But also, when you plant trees, it's going to be decades before they really start contributing in a meaningful way to atmospheric carbon drawdown, whereas existing forests are doing that every day, but could do a whole lot more of that if we would protect them a lot more than we have. And so we need to protect our existing forests. We also need to protect areas that have been damaged and degraded, that were forested, so they can be mature biodiverse forests once again. And this is something that we're going to need to do on a global scale. The reality is that in order to overcome the climate crisis, forest protection can be up to half of the climate change mitigation equation. And we can't get there without protecting forests. We simply can't do it. And so, policymakers around the world just need to, get their minds around this and start, taking action accordingly.
It sounds like in the United Kingdom, though, you really do need to replant a lot of trees, a lot of forests, because you've lost your forests.
It's certainly an important one. But sadly, we're sort of creating forests of one policy, and what little we have left, which is kind of what we're hoping to recall, as the wildlife resource, our ancient woodlands is under threat from development, from roads, from housing. Sadly, even though we've got hardly any of it left, it doesn't seem to work that's then protected. We've got to, I think from our perspective, we're kind of focusing on expansion, buffering what we already have, restoration, so those forests that are degraded, which we know is most of the forests in the UK are degraded, and protection. So it's kind of those three aims really is critical, and you miss one and the thing falls down.
Well, thank you both very much for being here today and shedding some light on the situation with our forests and with the actual truth about the burning of biomass. Thank you.